Hi everyone, this is a short video on how to prep your scene for rendering using Redshift. I've got three cubes here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a Redshift material to all of them and just show you how we can add and replace materials just by right-clicking on the geometry. So if I were to select the first cube, which if I look at my outliner, it's cube GO2. And if I were to right click on that geometry, at the very bottom of this menu, so this is called a marking menu, at the very bottom, you've got a couple different material options here. You've got assign new material, you've got assign favorite material, and assign an existing material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a new material, because I don't believe the Redshift materials come up under favorite materials at the moment. So I'm going to assign a new material. And this brings up this material selection menu. I'm going to find the Redshift category, which is right here. And for this, what we're going to do is just use the default Redshift material. This is a good one. It has a couple presets available, such as gold and silver, plastic, glass. So you don't really have to fool around with a lot of the attributes and settings. So I'm just going to click on that, and that's going to automatically assign that now to this object. Now I know it's on this object because if I go over here into the object's attribute editor, now remember that's Control A to open up the attribute editor. I can see the material is now at the far right column or tab, and that's usually where our material will exist. So if I look at the other two materials, you can see that this one has a Lambert, and this one also has a Lambert 1. Lambert 1 is the default material that exists on all objects, all renderable objects. It's this kind of default gray material. So I've got this Redshift material on here. Now I want to assign the same material to these other objects. Now I could have done them all at the same time just by rectangle selecting over those objects and done the exact same thing with the right mouse button. But because I've already assigned the one material, I want to assign the exact same one to these two objects. Now before I do, I'm just going to go back over to that Redshift material, and I can do that by clicking on the object and going into its Redshift material tab over here in the attribute editor. And I'm going to give it a color just so it's a little bit different from the Lambert materials, just so we can see this happen a little bit more easily. So I know that it's taking place. So I'm going to start by selecting this object, or I could do both at the same time. And I'm going to right click on that object. Now with both selected, it doesn't really matter if you click directly on them, or any selected object. It doesn't matter if you right click directly on them. Whichever objects are selected, the marking menu that pops up when you right click is associated to those objects. So I'm going to go down to assign existing material this time. Now you can see that there's the default Lambert. Now this is the material that again is on all objects by default, which is why it's called the default material. And then you can also see the Redshift material 1, which is that red material that we just assigned to that first cube. So I'm going to click on that. You can see that automatically that this has now changed these objects to this new red material. Now let's say I want two of these to be red, but then maybe the one in the middle to be a different material. Again, what I can do is I can right click on that middle object, and I'm going to go down to assign new material and just repeat the process again. So I can go to Redshift and assign a Redshift material, and now I can change the color, or I can assign a preset. So I mentioned that each of these Redshift, the Redshift material does have a lot of presets. Now unfortunately we're not going to really be able to see this so well in the viewport, so we're going to want to do what's called a test render or an interactive render, which allows us to update settings and see what it'll look like in the render in relatively real time. Now to do this, I'm going to switch over to my Redshift tab, over here in the shelf editor. And these first couple icons are associated with the rendering settings in the renderer. So you can see here we've got this one called the IPR. I'm just going to click on that. And that's going to open up this Redshift render view. And you can see that this play button is turned on. So that basically means that if I change my camera view, so if I orbit my camera, you can see how it's updating in real time in the renderer here, more or less. Now this is looking really dark. I'm probably going to want to bring in a light and then maybe add to that light just so that we have a slightly prettier render for presentation if we're going to light our scenes for the homework and project assignments in the beginning. So in my Redshift tab still, at the top you'll see that this next section of icons, these yellow ones, these are all different Redshift lights. Now for the homework and for project 1, all we're going to do is use a dome light, and we'll just assign an image as the light source. So we're going to be using what's called a high dynamic range image, or HDRI image light source, HDRI light source. So I'm going to click on this dome light. Now automatically you'll see that it gets overly lit. It's better than before, but it's too bright. Just a dome light on its own will flood out, basically wash out the image. But what we can do on this dome light, which is cool. So again, with this dome light selected, now you can select it. Let's say you deselect it by accident. You can click on it here in the viewport. It literally is this kind of dome shape. Or you can click on it in the outliner. Again, that will select it as well. Now inside its attributes, so under its shape node, so this is the middle tab, which should open by default. At the very top there's a little folder we can add in our image-based lighting. So I'm going to click on that folder, and in the source images directory that I gave you, so in the day 1 files project that I gave you, there are environment maps, and I'm just going to choose an exterior light source. So these are all basically just from Substance Painter. I just borrowed them. Yeah, let's see, let's try Corsica Beach maybe. And you can see that as soon as I add this in, we've got a much kind of more subtle lighting setup. And it's also going to reflect the environment because as a default, the Redshift material is slightly reflective. All right, so I'll just show you how to change the presets, and I think I'll end it there. And then the final output render. So just another few minutes. So I'm going to click on the red box just so I can go into the Redshift Material 1, so the red one. And I'm going to switch this into a default, or a preset, I should say. So maybe the red ones will be gold. So I'm going to click that and switch that to gold. All right, and that gives it kind of a defaulty kind of gold material. Now if you want, you could also rotate your image around, or the dome around, to change where the direction of the sun is coming from. All right, so let's say that's okay. And the middle one, the blue one, I'm going to select that cube and go to Redshift Material 2. Let's switch this to a glass. And that's going to be refractive, so basically we'll be able to see the world refracting through that. So that's pretty cool. So I want to do one more thing before we render this out. It's just to get rid of this kind of machine perfectly straight line on the polygon cubes. I want to add just a little bit of a bevel, but because we haven't talked about those options or those tools, I'm going to use a bit of a cheat. Render has a cool rounded edge texture that will add subtle bevels to hard surfaces without actually having to model in the bevel itself, which is neat. So I'll do it twice. The first one on the gold. So what we need to do is select the cube, go into the RS Material 1, and go down to the overall. And under overall, we've got this guy right here, bump map. So I'm going to click on that little checker pattern, and this will open up that material menu that we saw earlier, that material editor. Well, it's not really an editor, it's more of a menu. And we're going to go into, actually I'll just type it up here, and it'll isolate what's available. So I'm going to type in rounded. There it is, Redshift round corners. Oh, and you can see that's really kind of rounded out, and we get this weird dark outline. It also pops up over here in our attribute editor. So I'm just going to reduce the value. So 0.05 is way too much. So let's try 0.02. Oh, that's better. That's not too bad. Maybe 0.01. That's working even better. All right. Now let's try the glass one as well. Now the good thing about having the bevel is it just catches the light, so it defines the shape and volume a little bit more. It doesn't look quite so CG having that bevel there. Now this is a cheated bevel. It's using kind of a normal map along that edge to cheat the bevel, but again it works well. It looks pretty good. So again, on this middle cube, exactly the same thing. So we're just going to go to that RS Material tab, scroll down to Overall. We're going to select Bump Map. And this is actually still isolating round. So here it is right here, Redshift round corners. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm just going to give it a nice smaller value, so like 0.05 or maybe 0.02. Cool. And again, we get this nice kind of bevel from that. It's pretty good. Now, if you want to change the color of that glass, just one last thing, you'll find that under the refraction color. So I could maybe change this just a little bit to a different shade of whatever it is. If you're familiar with refractions, you'll be talking about this later on, I'm sure, in lighting, or even in systems, but you could also tweak the amount of refracted light just with that IOR setting there. But I think that's pretty good. Cool. All right, now the last thing we're going to do is just render this out and save it, and then you should be ready to render your homework in project 1. So to render it out, we just want to first of all go into our settings and change our settings slightly. So this tab here with the little sprocket, it's like a little gear icon. If I click on that, it'll open up our render settings pertaining to Redshift. So for this, we'll probably go square. Let's go with an HD square image, so maybe like a 2K is pretty good. And then that way we'll get height and width. We don't have to worry about the tops getting cropped off. And for output, what we're going to do is change the samples to a little bit higher just to reduce the grain. So let's go 50 to maybe, whoa, that's way too high, like maybe 300. And let's see. You can turn on GI. There's not really going to be a lot of reflected light, but let's see here. We'll just go brute force and brute force. Cool. And let's close that. So when you're ready to do your final render, you know, frame your scene. Now, if you want to see the frame a little bit better, we can click on this icon right here in our perspective window, and this will allow us to frame our scene just a little bit more accurately. Cool. And we just hit the render button. So we can turn off the IPR. So that's just clicking the play button off. And we can click on render, which is this guy. And Redshift is a GPU renderer. It's very fast. So it'll only just take a few seconds to render this out. There we go, it's done. Well, it looks pretty good. Looks pretty good for what it is. And then we just save it off. So File, Save Image As, and we're just going to save it as a JPEG. So we could call it example, and you could call it homework with your name, but So for example, if this was the homework, where we call it, it's the WER sculpt project, so WER, Chris, or my initials, so KDH, and then JPEG. All right. Cool. Now if you want to add a little bit of depth of field, just as a last note, you could do that by just going to the camera, and you can access the camera by either clicking on it in the outliner or going to view, select camera, and we can go into depth of field, just turn it on. That's going to blur everything out here, but you can double check here. So I'm going to turn on the IPR, and what I'm going to do is just change the focal distance. So I can do this by holding down Control and the middle mouse button in this box here, and this will increase and decrease that focal distance. Now because I'm only dealing with just a few centimeters, this shouldn't actually be that great of a distance, to be honest. But you can see as I manipulate this value, the frame's kind of rippling where that kind of focal center is. So I can see that, yeah, it's kind of getting this area as the main focus. So that's pretty good. Now that's fairly shallow focus, so what I might want to do is either increase the f-stop to allow to block some of the light, and that's going to sharpen that focal area a little bit. Or what I also might want to do is change the focal region just to expand the area that will be in focus. Right now it's only 1 unit, so I can expand that maybe to 3 units. So again, this area will be much more in focus, and then the background, because it's much further away, will be out of focus. So that's kind of an interesting effect too. So I mean, if I want this area to be a little bit more in focus, I would just reduce that focal distance down a little bit. So again, that's just control middle mouse button inside the attribute, or inside the box here. So you can see that this is much more in focus, and then it gets out of focus the further from camera. All right, and then I can just do one more render and save it off, and that would be, and that's that. Cool, and save image as, and I'll just save it as the exact same thing. And I'll stop the recording there.